Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the English Civil War. In this installment, The Battle Begins, we will talk about how King Charles was confronted by a rebellion in Scotland. To raise enough funds to suppress this rebellion, King Charles needed to do something he never wanted to do, call Parliament. And while Charles and Parliament argued over the terms of taxes and armies, a second rebellion in Ireland caught both of them off guard. The English Civil War began on July 23, 1637, at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, Scotland. As part of his program for unity and harmony across Great Britain, King Charles wanted the Anglican Book of Common Prayer read in Presbyterian churches in Scotland. When the Dean and Bishop of St. Giles Cathedral tried to read from the Anglican book to their devoutly Presbyterian subjects, the women in the cathedral pelted them with footstools. More church riots spread throughout Scotland during the summer and fall. Soon enough, the Scots didn't just want the books out, they wanted the bishops out. And they stated as much on February 28, 1638, in the National Covenant, signed in a 4-hour ceremony filled with psalm singing and the delivery of sermons. Laborers signed their names alongside lords. Many copies circulated throughout Scotland. Those willing to sign the National Covenant were seen as true Scotsmen and real Christians. Those who did not were seen as traitors. King Charles was shocked at the defiance in his homeland, so he raised the militias of England's northern counties to suppress the Scot rebels. The militia, of course, was easily defeated by the Presbyterian rebels. If King Charles wanted a professional army to suppress the rebellion, he needed to raise £1 million. He could only get that kind of money by doing something he never wanted to do, calling Parliament. He did just that on April 13, 1640. King Charles imagined that the parliamentarians would set aside old grievances and fork over the taxes needed to suppress the Scots. Of course, Parliament would do anything but. It was later claimed that the Civil War was simply an accident. Yet, in fact, the clique around the defiant Earl of Warwick, leader of the opposition, was already in touch with both the Scottish rebels and had suborned the northern militias for a possible march on London to force King Charles to come to terms. King Charles knew of Warwick's scheme through royal spies and had already asked Spain for help. In effect, both sides had already committed treason, which made compromise even more difficult, and the first meeting of Parliament in 11 years even more awkward. Right off the bat, Parliament demanded the right to decide what taxes were legal and which ones weren't in exchange for King Charles' army. King Charles, of course, didn't much care for this solution, so his right-hand man, the Earl of STRAFFORD, suggested that instead of trying to appease Parliament to raise a Protestant army, they simply raise an Irish Catholic army to suppress the Scots Presbyterians. An enraged Parliament shouted down the idea. Not surprisingly, King Charles dismissed them a mere 3 weeks later, and thus the short Parliament more than lived up to its name. Yet that didn't stop the anger within England. Deference broke down. Soldiers began attacking their own officers if they suspected them of being loyal to the wrong party. The Scottish Presbyterians took control of Newcastle, along with its huge coal reserves. Vast crowds gathered in London, even near the royal palace, and called for the heads of royal advisors who they believed had led them into this disaster. King Charles must have smelled the gunpowder because he called Parliament again on November 3, 1640. The Long Parliament would more than live up to its name as it met continuously for the next 13 years. The Long Parliament must have sensed Charles' desperation because they took advantage of it. They told King Charles that he would not have his army unless he agreed to never dissolve Parliament without their consent, call a new Parliament every 3 years without exception, abolish the royal courts, and of course pass no taxes without Parliament's consent. Any chance of King Charles agreeing to such terms vanished when Strafford again raised the idea of an Irish army to suppress Scotland, a very foolish idea. John Pym, the leader of the opposition in Parliament, decided to literally kill the idea. Pym dragged the aging, sickly, and grey-haired Earl of Strafford into Parliament for trial. Yet Strafford proved surprisingly eloquent and persuasive in his defense, always maintaining that he sought only to serve King Charles and England. Unable to make a charge of treason stick, Pym instead wrote a Bill of Attainder, in which he claimed, rather disingenuously, that the Irish Catholic army was meant not for war in Scotland, but in England. Nonetheless, Parliament passed the Bill of Attainder, yet it could not become law unless King Charles signed it. Charles, who valued loyalty above all else, was thrown into a crisis of conscience. He remembered how one of his older favorites, George Villiers, had been murdered only 15 years prior. Yet in the end, it was the Earl of Strafford who ended King Charles' dilemma by asking his king and friend to execute him, as that was the only way to appease Parliament and prevent civil war. King Charles sobbed as he signed the death warrant, and a few days later the Earl of Strafford had his head chopped off while a crowd pelted him with garbage and shouted curses at him. Yet while the king and Parliament were arguing over the Earl of Strafford, the shooting had already begun. In the summer of 1641, Irish Catholics rebelled not only against the Protestant government which ruled their island, but the Protestant settlers who lived in the northeast of the country. 40 years prior, thousands of Irish Catholics had been forced from their homes in the northeast of the island and left in abject poverty. Meanwhile, the cleared lands were filled by whole villages of Scottish Presbyterians, often led by their preachers, who began new lives in Northern Ireland and provided the king with loyal and Protestant bulwarks in a rebellious Catholic island. The Catholic rebels invaded Protestant homesteads and chopped down the grain and burned houses. This first wave of violence was simply against property. Yet things escalated horrifically in November 1641, when colonial military commanders began targeting the Catholic population of Ireland for wholesale slaughter and mass executions. Enraged Catholics defied their own commanders and began slaughtering Protestants en masse. In one of the most widely publicized atrocities, 100 Protestant men, women, and children were driven to the river Bann. There they were drowned, and those who refused to stay in the water were shot. One woman named Elizabeth claimed that she saw all 5 of her children drowned before her. Atrocity prints began circulating throughout England. Of course, they ignored the clearances that took place 40 years prior. They also chose not to mention the massive atrocities by Protestant commanders that led to the massacres in the first place. They also turned the 3,000 or 4,000 murdered Protestants into 150,000 slaughtered, massacres on a par with those that plagued Europe during the 30 Years' War, then still raging on the continent. Half-panicked readers were told about people being impaled and forced into their houses where they were burned alive, of England Anglican pastors being lynched from trees, and rebels smashing babies' heads against walls and dashing out their brains on the timber. Street corner orators began claiming that the Irish rose in the name of King Charles, and that they would soon swarm across the Irish Sea and bring the same atrocities to England. The mood in London became so hostile and so angry that King Charles fled, fearing for his life and the lives of his family, to the royalist stronghold of York in June 1641. By this time, it would take a miracle to keep civil war from erupting in England. In the next episode, we will see if such a miracle took place. That wraps things up for this installment of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.